Hey everyone, just want to let you know that we have a Q&A episode coming out in July, and we are accepting questions for the Q&A episode right now.
If you'd like to submit a question to our July Q&A, go to GenreVision.com, and there on the main page you'll see a post that you can leave your questions in. Just click on the post and go to the comments section, type it in right there, or you can find the contact page there at GenreVision.com and send us a question that way. You can also email us questions directly to GenreVisionPod@gmail.com.
Make sure to get your questions in by the end of June, and we can get them answered on the July Q&A episode of GenreVision. Greetings, loyal listeners and new recruits. I'm Drew Deach.
I'm Travis Newton.
And this is GenreVision.
GenreVision is a weekly movie club where we discuss horror films, action movies, fantasy flicks, sci-fi cinema, and more.
And we are continuing Time Travel Month with Slaughterhouse-Five, the adaptation of the, I don't think it's unfair to call it a classic novel by Kurt Vonnegut. This was a first watch for me. I know, Travis, you had seen this movie before, but I have read the book before and you have not. This was one that was always on my radar, but I never really took the plunge on, not because I had any particular reservations about it. From all accounts, the movie is very highly regarded, even by Vonnegut himself. And upon watching Slaughterhouse-Five, it was an experience that made me realize a couple things. One of them being how incredibly influential this story and particularly this adaptation was. But for anybody who doesn't know, the basic premise of Slaughterhouse-Five centers around a character called Billy Pilgrim, who is, quote, unstuck in time. And his consciousness is basically jumping throughout different moments of his life, and he's re-experiencing them, or maybe this is the first time he's experiencing them. We can kind of get into that. And a big chunk of this, looking back in his life, deals with his time in the U.S. military service during World War II. It's a bleak movie, and I think a pretty bleak story, but that doesn't mean it's a bad time watching it.
No, it is a classic adaptation of a classic novel. It's a very different kind of science fiction film than we usually cover here on GenreVision, but I think as a film about a time traveler, I think it was pretty crucial that we cover something like this that was a little bit outside of what people think about as like classic time travel films. This is pretty markedly different from the novel in a few ways, and I didn't know about this until I started doing research for our episode today. One of the crucial things that the film doesn't clearly define is when Billy starts to experience this ability or curse to travel through time non-linearly. He experiences traveling through life like we experience memories of it, where, suddenly we'll follow this one thread, something will remind us of something and we'll have a memory of it. But for him, he's transported there and experiences it. In the book, he experiences, the onset of this, I suppose, when he is a POW before the bombing of Dresden. In the movie, it's not exactly clearly defined. There's a moment that I assume comes after he has returned from World War II, where he is on the lawn outside with his dog, and he sees some sort of light blob traveling through space toward him, and that the meaning of that isn't elucidated until later on in the film. But I don't know if they've changed that to be the moment when Billy Pilgrim becomes aware, or at least sort of awakens to his new abilities.
Yeah, from my memory, he is abducted in the book very early on by these aliens from a planet called Tralfamadore.
Tralfamadore, I believe it is.
Yeah, see, it's Monday energy, y'all. We're recording this on a Monday, and this movie's asking me to say nonsense words. I think this movie had to take this kind of artful approach to adaptation, because I think if you did it kind of more straightforward, it might lose some of the impact of the themes and the tone of the story. And I mean, Vonnegut himself has highly praised this as what is probably the best adaptation of anything he's done. And that's interesting because normally when we think about adaptation, we think about fealty to the source material. And I think this one, as you're saying, pretty key differences from the book. It's not about fealty to the source material as writ, as canon. It's fealty to what kind of themes and moods the book was trying to achieve. And I think the movie does a very good job at that. One of my big takeaways from this was actually a reaffirmation of what I love about genre storytelling, because you could ostensibly tell this story with no sci-fi alien genre element and just it's a nonlinear look at a certain person's life. I hesitate to call it a character study, but it's much more just viewing the world through one particular person's memories and life, and you're doing that in a nonlinear fashion. There have been plenty of movies that have done that with no genre element, but it is the genre element in Slaughterhouse-Five that adds a whole nother, just layers of intrigue and makes the story, I think, more unique and even compelling. And especially the way that the film version is structured, where the harder sci-fi elements are really saved until the very end.
Yeah, in this particular adaptation, I think the use of those genre elements throughout the film really deepens the commentary about how humans experience and re-experience life and trauma through memory, because trauma is a specific kind of memory, and the way that it is felt and continues to be felt throughout our lifetimes in our thoughts and in our bodies is markedly different. And Vonnegut, when he wrote the text, was certainly speaking from a place of experience, because he was fighting in Europe in World War II. Even though Billy Pilgrim is not really a self-insert by Vonnegut, Billy Pilgrim differs from Vonnegut in some key ways. One of them is that Billy is a chaplain in the army. He's not joining up to be, he's not joining up to be an infantryman. I can't remember if Billy is drafted or not.
He is drafted. Yes.
Okay, he is drafted.
He talks about how he was going to school to be an orthodontist. But
right.
he got drafted, but he wasn't mad about it or resisting it. The only disappointment when he was is that he was in the middle of school, and he was like, "Oh, I really wanted to complete school because I believe being an orthodontist is going to allow me to help people, and that's what I think is kind of my purpose and our purpose as humanity, is to help each other." And I think that the film version of Slaughterhouse-Five, if I have a criticism, it's not really a criticism of the movie itself, but of just the medium of adaptation, in that Billy Pilgrim, while we see the fullness of his life and we see many integral moments that shape who he is as a character, he is, I think, presented somewhat more passively, because the movie has a lot more that it has to deal with, as opposed to in a novel, especially in the novel, where it can assume Billy's total perspective by being in the first person, so that we are completely in his head.
Right. This is a story in which a lot of things happen to Billy, but it doesn't feel like he has an internal locus of control. Everything is happening to him. He's not making a whole lot of things happen. So we're seeing this, being drafted into World War II. And at the beginning of his stint in World War II, we see him trying to escape combat, but he is caught and brought back, and is later then captured. So it's this whole thing of him being pushed and directed by other forces into his life events. You don't get to see a whole lot of, for instance, like his courtship with the woman he marries in the film. You do, however, get to see what kind of things that she does in his life, and they don't paint an especially flattering portrait of his wife. The rather great performance, though, I forget the wife's name, but the actress who plays her does such a great job with a really strange character.
The character is Val Valencia, played by Sharon Gans. and she is great in the movie. She is one of the sources of humor. Granted, it is often almost totally at her expense.
Yeah, she's almost like a John Waters character in some moments. There's something kind of like painfully like suburban about her. There is this really kind of cruel running gag about her always wanting to lose weight for her husband. And yet it never happens.
But we never get the sense that pressure is coming from Billy.
Correct. Yeah.
It seems to be something that is self-imposed from her that she never fulfills.
Exactly. And it adds also to the sense that Billy is very passive throughout this narrative.
Yes.
One of the few things that we see Billy doing that really feels like he's taking control is the scene in which he's introduced at the beginning of the film is a scene where he has, two adult children who are coming to his house to look for him because nobody's seen him. They think, he might be, might have died in there or something like that. Turns out he's just kind of shut himself away in his study to write a letter to the editor, I forget at what publication, about his experience becoming unstuck in time. And so he's starting to, take steps to tell his own story. And that is in some ways Billy taking control over an experience or a lifetime of experiences.
Well, there's a key scene. I mean, this is a very difficult movie to talk about linearly because it's not a linear movie. But there is the one scene that really, it's one of the first times that the genre drama gets brought to the forefront, in which Billy is boarding a plane to go on this conference. And he starts having these surreal visions where he sees these people in absolutely bizarre ski masks out in the crowd waving goodbye while they're boarding the plane. And it's a moment of genuine surreal horror. And it then realizes Billy is he is being shown at a point in the very recent future that the plane is going to crash. Right. And he gets, and it is the first time that we really see Billy. And this is when he's older and he's been living his life and everything. That is the first time he gets up and he's like, the plane's going to crash. And he, goes up to the pilot and is like, listen to me, the plane's going to crash. We need to stop. We cannot take off. And then he immediately, gets shut down and everybody thinks he's playing a joke. And there is this realization that Billy, I think, doesn't believe he can change the world, because I think because so much of this story is actually a World War II story, it's exploring an angle about war that I think we rarely get to see specifically in mainstream film, and especially as applied to World War II, a conflict which by the majority is painted very binary. And even if it is, here's the horrors of war and the struggles of this, there's almost always a blanket understanding of, well, if we're being shown the Allies, if we're being shown U.S. troops, it's all good, and the Nazis are supervillains. And there's something I really like about Slaughterhouse-Five, in that it's talking much more about the mundane evils of war. I hate to quote that, usual banality of evil. I don't think that's the specific case here, but it is that, like, no, war is not always a big bombastic, good versus evil thing. There's just something much more mundane, and in a way that is more terrifying. And our attempts to try and change that, at least from the movie's version of the text.
Right. They show combat in the movie, for instance. They show combat, which is not unusual for a war film, but the context in which they show it is it seems to be just chaos that Billy doesn't really have a goal in, because he himself is not a combatant. He's not an infantryman. He's not going to pick up a gun and fight. We don't see where the enemies are. There's really no geography established to the combat. It's just something that he's been trying to escape. We don't see acts of heroism, for instance. There are certainly plenty of acts of violence that seem weirdly mundane. There's a sequence where, after marching through the mud behind a character that doesn't have any shoes on, his boots have been lost somehow, Billy is looking at a pretty girl in a window and keeps stepping on the backs of this guy's feet. This guy with the no boots on later dies of gangrene because his feet start rotting, and another soldier, this guy named Lazaro, blames Billy for this other soldier's death. And this ends up, this very small thing, this very, it's almost like a joke when it happens, when he keeps stepping on the guy's feet, but it ultimately causes Billy's death as well. This odd irony that, echoes through time.
Yes, because eventually this character Lazaro, who is this extremely brash, braggadocious, just asshole of a character who has it out for Billy from pretty much the get-go, and then when his friend is seemingly not killed by Billy, but Billy's actions lead to some element of this person's death, Lazaro continually throughout the movie is telling Billy Pilgrim, like, I'm going to kill you. You don't know when it's going to happen. It might be today. It might be tomorrow. It might be years from now. You never know when it's going to, you don't know when it's going to happen to you.
Yeah. Lazaro is death. He's the specter of death that haunts Billy throughout the entire movie.
Yeah. There's so much. I mean, and because this is from a piece of literature, we're not going to be able to, and a very well-respected and well-analyzed piece of literature, we're not going to be able to pick apart every single piece of this as far as the symbolism of certain things and characters. But I do think a big point of the movie, it's an anti-war movie, and it's a very unique anti-war movie, because a lot of anti-war movies, I think, take a different sort of rah-rah route to them. Like they're like, we're anti-war, but we're kind of feeling that, fists up in unison, like screw you war feel. Slaughterhouse-Five has a much more somber and kind of singularly meditative outlook on anti-war sentiments. Because it shows, like, again, the majority of this movie is people just being herded around. And, again, that there's that passiveness, and a big part of this story centers around a real event, which was the bombing of the city of Dresden. It is completely set up to, it's like we're seeing this city that's full of German citizens, not military combatants or anything, that were murdered. And it's like, that happened. And the movie is clearly trying to talk about, we did this, and it has been mostly forgotten in the conversation around that particular conflict. There's a moment later where Billy is in the hospital after he survives that plane crash that he knew was going to happen. And the guy that's in the bed next to him is this historian that's compiling and writing a book about World War II, and is specifically talking about the bombing of Dresden. And he's going on about, like, oh, all these bleeding hearts, talking, saying that this was a terrible thing. It was necessary. It was war. What about, all the concentration camps? What about, and he just goes off on whataboutisms. Yeah. And Billy's resignation in that moment, being like, I can't change how history is going to view this. But the sentiment of anti-war is there, and it's in a really appropriately, considering that the majority of these war scenes take place during the winter. It's a cold anti-war movie.
It is. I mean, it's very chilly, and the way that it detaches itself from so much of the kind of scenes we see in war films is very, very, it's very pointedly done. They want to show a side of this that is pretty unconventional as far as war films go. Even from that era. One of the things they did, I think, that was so good in selling this portion of the movie, the war portion of the movie, was a lot of the location shooting. I mean, the shots in winter, I mean, my God, some of them had to be they all had to be freezing their fucking asses off. And it just looks like such misery. And then some of the extras they cast, and, seeing some of the locals in those locations is like, ooh, this is I hesitate to say realistic, but it creates such a unique impact. There's one character, there's this young German kid, this young German soldier who keeps appearing throughout the movie.
He's continually kind of berating to the U.S. prisoners of war, but he keeps eyeing this one German girl, and they clearly have kind of a relationship. And when the bombing of Dresden occurs and they come back out and look at all the rubble, this German soldier runs to her house to try and find her, and it's just smoldering ash. He's running through her building and it's all on fire, and he's screaming her name. And it's a moment of like, this is showing that these people that we have painted historically as a monolithic monster, that they were people, that they were humans, and we need to at least acknowledge some level of empathy for them, because they're humans too.
Right. Now, this is not a Nazi sympathizer film, and this is not a Nazi sympathizing story, but it's taking one character, basically is like, look, we're going to use this to represent some sort of element of humanity, even in the enemy.
Well, and also I think it's a great illustration of how you craft enemies.
Mm-hmm.
You know, how you create another generation that will carry on feelings of hatred. And by no means, like you said, this is not a Nazi sympathizer movie. Far from it. There is a moment in this movie that is shocking, that is so chilling as well, to the commentary it has, where there are a bunch of U.S. and British prisoners of war that have been carted around to different camps and stuff, and they're treated fairly, you know, comparatively, which I like. I like that we see shots of other people, potentially Jews, who knows, potentially, you know, local soldiers who are behind barbed wire. They look starved. They look like the images that we've seen in so much World War II media.
Sure.
Whereas the U.S. and the British soldiers, they show them in relative comfort. And then there's this moment where a U.S. soldier comes and speaks to them all and is telling them that, look, you'll be able to go home and we'll be able to send you to your families if we just totally empathize and in some ways not cooperate, but at least turn a blind eye to Germany's war, you know, what they're doing in the war. And this character is delivering all of this while wearing a Nazi SS uniform that has also got the American flag integrated into it, where the American flag colors are part of the Nazi swastika.
Yeah, it is insane. I mean, like, I couldn't. There was such a moment there where I was like, I can scarcely believe what I'm seeing here. Is basically some sort
after
of
what he says.
Yeah, exactly. It was some sort of American that, you know, had been turned into a Nazi propaganda machine, and then there are just such strange echoes of this throughout Billy's life. You know, later on, after Billy becomes very aware of his ability, we see his son come back from Vietnam, and his son has like gotten way into the anti-communist stuff. You know, his son enlisted to go to Vietnam.
Well, when we first meet his son, he is this absolute punk. Like, you know, Billy catches him masturbating. And, you know, in the bathroom, he's this punk kid, you know, kind of, you know, he's getting in trouble. Like, he gets in trouble for tipping over gravestones at a cemetery, and Billy pretty much, you know, pays off the cops to keep, which in some ways it's like, well, I think it's talking about Billy's unknown complicity in turning this person into a vehicle that was susceptible to military propaganda.
Mm-hmm.
Because towards the end, after Billy is essentially alone and his son comes and visits him and tells him, you know, it's like, I signed up, like, what we're doing, we got to stop the communists. Like, the communists are going to destroy our way of life. And Billy's, at this point, his passiveness I think he's originally passive because he just, you know, doesn't want to cause any trouble. He doesn't want to, you know, rock the boat or anything. But as we see him as an older person, I think his passiveness is from a learned position of like, it doesn't matter what I do. It's in a way, it's very defeatist.
It's defeat, it's acceptance. And in a way, it's also victory, because he is also sort of living this bizarre fantasy life simultaneously on Tralfamadore, where these unseen aliens who are basically just, you know, men behind the curtain have orchestrated this life in this little geodesic dome on Tralfamadore for him. I'm reminded a little bit of another great nonlinear movie, The Fountain, by Darren Aronofsky,
mm-hmm.
where, you know, Hugh Jackman's character is sort of alone in this bubble floating through space on this great journey. And you know, there's a little bit of that here in Slaughterhouse-Five, where these Tralfamadorians have experimented on Billy to make him this character who travels through time differently than everybody else. And they tap into Billy's sexual fantasies, and they find this porn star that he used to lust over, and they bring her to him.
I don't think she's a porn star. I think she's a movie star who the one movie that we see her in was this extremely explicit movie that they went and the whole family went to go see at the drive-in. She's in some sequence. Oh God, what were they called? The Peplum pictures,
something like that,
where it's all this like Roman debauchery stuff, and she's totally topless in some spa, and his wife's just like, oh, I can't believe this is such filth, this is so horrible, and his daughter's trying to cover the son's eyes, and Billy's just sitting there like, yeah. I'm not exaggerating. That is the expression that he has on his face during that scene.
They make sure to let you know, like, Billy's kind of a lustful guy. And to have him bust his son jacking off to porn later on is, the irony of that is not lost on me. Michael Sachs, the guy who plays Billy, I'd seen him in only one other movie, and that movie was the Amityville Horror. And I mean, I remember so little of the Amityville Horror because it's not a good movie. But it surprised me that he didn't have a bigger career, because he did get some recognition for his performance here in this movie. I believe he was nominated for a Golden Globe, which today wouldn't be a whole lot, but it's I think it would be significant for somebody of his age. And also, like, I think he displays such an incredible amount of restraint in this performance. I think it would be easy, in some moments to go really dramatic, like when the plane is crashing, for instance, and he's trying to, convince other people. But there is this defeat and fatalism in the performance, this passivity that I think informs everything, and Sachs does it beautifully.
I think he's doing a good job as well. However, it is the kind of role that is almost thankless for most actors, because it's not one that's going to get immediate recognition. Like it because of those kind of choices. A lot of times those kind of choices are the more difficult ones to pull off well. And so I do like him in the movie, but I think, again, just as written, Billy is such a passive character in his own story that I think it's easy to look at the performance and be like, he's not doing much of anything. It's like, no, he is. And, but it's a very small, and I don't mean that in a quality way. It's a small performance, and that's okay.
One of the most important things I think we see Billy do in his performance is observing. He is sort of our documentarian through this story, because it's a story about more than just him, but his perspective is absolutely crucial in it. And the way that his perspective sort of weaves in and out of memories is I think a defining aspect of the film's time travel. Like, there is a moment when we see sort of an early trauma for him, and while it doesn't seem to be like a hugely significant trauma, but there's a moment where we see Billy, I don't know, I think in single digits years, obviously, carried out of a public pool, like locker room, by his dad, and his dad just dumps him in the deep end of the pool. And
he's totally nude.
Yeah, there's an incredible shot out of focus underwater as we see, this very blurry young Billy drifting down through the light. And then there's this incredible transition back to, coming back into focus on a lamp, back in Germany in the POW camp. And it's like, damn, these transitions are just one of the defining aspects of how the movie pulls this off. Like, every time. Every transition's great.
It is a masterpiece of editing, and it's something that I strongly want to believe that the majority of those had to be written in the script, because it feels like it's not something that you can piece together in the edit. There's so many moments that the adaptation of the book to the screen was done by Stephen Geller. And I have to believe that so many of those transitions are in the script, because this movie is so good at pretty much every time it does that. And it also utilizes the tools of cinema in really unique and interesting ways and effective ways to overlay this discordance that Billy feels, being someone who is unstuck in time.
Right. There's a really extensive use of pre-lap and post-lap. So pre-lap would be audio from the next scene intruding upon a prior scene, and then we get our transition, what is often called a J cut, where the audio comes before the video cut. And then L cuts, where the audio persists after a scene has finished and goes into the next scene. One of the most shocking bits of transition and juxtaposition in the movie comes when the Tralfamadorians are talking to him about like the eventual death of the universe, which is caused by a Tralfamadorian trying to like work on some hyper efficient fuel, and it blows up and ends up blowing up the universe, which is very darkly hilarious in kind of a Douglas Adams way. Immediately after, and also during, there is a sequence where Billy and several other soldiers are made to douse piles of bodies in like kerosene or gasoline and light them on fire. And I was like, good God, that moment of juxtaposition is one of the most darkly comic, but also incredibly sobering and horrifying. Like just that mix of particular emotions is one of the things the movie does best, and that's one of the best moments of it. It's not pleasant to describe, and it's certainly unpleasant to watch, but you can't argue with the fucking craft. And the editor on this was Dee Dee Allen, who was a fucking master. She edited Bonnie and Clyde. She edited Serpico, Dog Day Afternoon, The Breakfast Club, The Addams Family. She edited the Addams Family movie for Barry Sonnenfeld. So a really great master editor.
Well, and there's good comedy in the edits as well.
Oh yeah,
and it's sometimes very darkly comic. When Billy crashes in the plane and is found and taken to the hospital, we cut to his wife Val just frantically driving in her white Cadillac all across the highway, going down, into the wrong exit, smashing into cars and just screaming at people like, I can't, I gotta go, my Billy needs me. Mm-hmm. And she's just tearing this thing apart. We then cut to her in bed, and it's apparently her birthday, and Billy has this ribbon that he's, strung throughout the house, like, no, come on, you got to follow the ribbon. Like, what is it? And then they get outside, and it's the white Cadillac.
Yeah.
And she's like, oh, a white Cadillac. It's what I've always wanted, Billy. Oh my goodness. Cut back to her just slamming this thing through traffic.
Sure. Oh yeah. This is the kind of shit Alanis Morissette wishes she wrote about in the 90s.
Sure.
Take that, ironic.
I mean, it's funny, but it is also tragic, especially because eventually she runs her car into the wall outside the hospital, and it eventually kills her.
Right.
It's bleak, but it's funny. Like, it's legitimately funny. But then, when they actually deliver the news that, like, to Billy's daughter who's there, they're like, yeah, because she's like, oh, Dad's going to be okay. Where's Mom? Like, I need to call Mom. And they're like, well, hold on a second. It's her husband. So Billy's son-in-law, who's telling her, like, your mom's dead. Like, she died on the way here. And it's like, man, this is like, again, it is funny, particularly because of the editing, but that grimness follows Billy throughout his life and continues to be a reflection of, I think, how he feels about death. There's a thing in the book that is not referenced at all in the movie, which is one of the cornerstones of the book. And it's a saying. The Tralfamadorian saying about death is, so it goes. And every time in the book that Billy is presented with a very prominent or poignant moment about death, he in his head recites, so it goes. That is never spoken or even thought in the movie, but there is this sort of, it again sums up this sort of passive, like, what are you going to do kind of attitude about death. And as Billy begins to understand what's going on with him, and later in life when he's starting to, write letters and write his story, and we see him at his very advanced age going around and giving speeches about his experience and what he's learned from it. It is very much about, like, the thesis of the movie seems to be like, death and awfulness are inevitable. There's nothing we can do to stop it. So instead, we need to try and take away the good things in life and focus on them, because the bad things are always going to happen.
It's an incredibly simple and universal message. And if there's anything to take away from the movie that is kind of feel good, it's that, because The sort of lighter elements of the film are really confusing. Like his whole time spent in the dome on Tralfamadore with this actress, who eventually, has his new child. Is like, what is this? What's going on here? Like, what is this fantasy? What is this bizarre heaven that Billy has been allowed to live in? And there's some funny satire in that they talk about all the furniture in the dome being supplied by Sears. Today that would be a joke about IKEA.
Sure, Billy mentions because he tells the aliens to dim the lights so that they can try and get to know each other. And while they're doing that, he's commenting on all the furniture, and it's like, yeah, it's really nice. They ordered it all from Sears and Roebuck.
Yeah, mm-hmm.
And it's like, yeah. I mean, this I don't think it's fair to try and apply kind of typical act structure to this movie because it's like it's a nonlinear narrative, and the way that it's trying to explore itself in that way is kind of going to be antithetical to typical movie storytelling structure.
Sure. In the last third of this movie, like we normally expect the last third of a movie to be like escalating action, excitement. That's not what happens here. The last third of this movie is more meditative and strange, and so like it suddenly becomes, what was a lot more exciting or taught in the second act of the film. This kind of relaxes and is allowed to be just sort of absurd, and it's definitely a change because we've only seen like one scene of their interaction early in the film where she's like, time travel's a bitch for you, ain't it?
Yes, that's very, very early on. It's absurd in not just humorous ways. There's earlier in the movie, Billy talks about he's pressured at this social get together by his wife to talk about this man that he knew in the POW camp that was killed. And you can tell that it's not something that Billy wants to talk about or think about. And we know. So it's like, okay, that guy who is a character that we have met previously, who's this very like affable blue collar American kind of guy that's a friend to Billy. And he's the one that's elected to kind of be the representative for the US POWs. We know he's going to die. Like we are told straight up, like he died and he was shot. And towards the end of the movie, after the bombing of Dresden has happened and they're having the POWs burn these corpses and take care of the rubble, they very directly tell them, like, if you're caught stealing anything, from the wreckage, you will be shot. And this guy finds this little ceramic doll and he comments on like, wow, look at this. It's just like the one I had back at home. There's not a scratch on it. And it's this miraculous moment. It's like out of all of this destruction, there's this completely untouched, beautiful little doll. And then a bunch of straight up SS officers see him. And I love that there's no subtitles in German. I think that's very pointed and appropriate.
Mm-hmm.
It keeps us distance from what they might be actually, what they're saying. They see him with that, and he's like, oh, look at that. Yeah. Like isn't that incredible? And they just walk him over and shoot him. And it's not Billy, that is one moment where Billy freaks out. Like he runs at them and is like, no, why? Like, why? Like, and this sounds very simplistic and armchair philosopher, but that's kind of a big question that Billy continues to ask himself in regards to his feelings about war and American life. Is like, why? Like, why are these things happening? And the eventual defeatism of it, I think, does come from an optimistic place, because by the end of his life, Billy is talking about, the way we perceive time is wrong. Like all time is happening all at the same time. Dr. Manhattan is clearly a character that was inspired by Billy Pilgrim.
For sure. Yeah. This whole idea of, everything concurrent is a way to find a key into Dr. Manhattan's mindset. But I don't think Dr. Manhattan's mindset is ever captured as well in any of the Watchmen media as it is here. Like, I really do think this is one of the best representations of someone living a nonlinear life.
Sure. I mean, I not to get too much off on that tangent, but it's because I think as characters, Dr. Manhattan and Billy Pilgrim are both very passive, but there are points with, I think, Pilgrim's just a much more human character. Part of Dr. Manhattan's whole deal is that he is, detaching himself from humanity.
Right. At a certain point, he doesn't see himself as human anymore.
Well, and he's also lying to himself about his own human feelings. He wants to deny those things. And that's not Billy. Like, Billy's not denying what he feels. He's just recognizing that it doesn't matter what I feel or what I believe in, because the world is going to keep churning on the way it's been churning on forever.
Right. Billy is, a very normal character, a very mundane character, aside from this alien superpower he's been given. But for a young man to have gone through what he went through at the time, as a member of that generation, it's as weird and cruel to say is, like, it's not all that unusual for someone of his age, from his background, to have gone through what he did, going through World War II. And to have these experiences, which of course mean everything to him, because they're, that's what you have in life, is your wealth of experiences. To see it laid out non-linearly takes these moments and allows them to be put into new context and allows for new echoes to be placed. Like, it's fantastic narrativizing. To be able to sort of ping off to one earlier moment in Billy's life, or, to take a few scenes aside to explore Billy's relationship with his dog, or to be able to take these little side roads into things that are relevant about him. Is like, normally we don't get a whole lot of that in movies. And that is largely due to the pressing, advance of time and having to keep pushing forward in the story. Here, the movie doesn't feel a need to do that. And I think the director, who we haven't yet mentioned, is George Roy Hill. Like, he did an excellent job with it. I mean, just the guy was on a hot streak. He did Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid in 1969. He did Slaughterhouse-Five in 1972. And then he did The Sting the next year. I mean, damn.
That's a run. It's a wonderfully directed film. I mean, kind of coming around to final thoughts on this is it's a well-directed film. It's a well-constructed film. It's a very good film, but before we started recording, I described it to you as sleepy. And I don't mean that, again, as a negative. This is a very meditative, kind of contemplative movie, especially in regards to a lot, for the majority of it, how it's utilizing its genre element of time travel. Mm. It's not a big, I also believe that his unique method of time travel, and that, well, it's my consciousness jumping back to my own body and the things that I experienced. It's not like, there isn't a semblance of like, oh, now I'm back in World War II and I could run over there and kill Hitler. Like, right. Not that kind of thing.
It's not him having the chance to be the author of his own story. It's to simply re-experience it, or experience all of it at the same time. It is a story about reminiscence as re-experience, which indeed it is. But also, when we remember something, we're also rewriting it in our heads at the same time. The nature of memory is to be imperfect. But for him, memory has become something else entirely, and it's often so directly tied to how we re-experience trauma. Especially with post-traumatic stress. And for this to come from, somebody like Vonnegut, it makes a lot of sense.
Well, I definitely recommend this movie. I think it's a classic, but I feel like it's kind of an underserved classic at this point, because I think it's not an easy watch. This isn't a crowd pleaser. This isn't especially in the genre of time travel. I think when a lot of people think about time travel, they think about very straightforward, entertaining uses of it as a genre storytelling mechanism. And that's not this. This is, as I said, contemplative. It's really sitting there and stewing with a lot of big, difficult, and harrowing ideas. I think it does it very effectively, just as the novel did. But I think as a film, it's an absolute touchstone. And I'm glad I finally got around to seeing it. But I think we can head over to the shelf now, where we pick some movies or other things that we can recommend as either pairings or substitutes for our main topic. And we encourage you, loyal listener, to go to GenreVision.com and comment on the post for this episode with your own shelf picks. Travis, what are you going to pull off the shelf for Slaughterhouse-Five?
Well, I don't know. Maybe this is an easy choice or kind of an eye roller of a choice, but one of the things I really loved about Slaughterhouse-Five as a movie is that it's really dependent upon good effects makeup. You know, we need to see Billy at a variety of ages, and most of the time he's going to be played by the same young actor who, at the time, was like positively baby-faced. I mean, you see him without any of the effects makeup on, you're like, that's a kid. That is a boy. But the aging that they did on him was done by John Chambers, the guy who did the makeup effects for the Planet of the Apes. You know, it was famously played by John Goodman in the movie Argo. Another movie that is dependent upon similar kinds of aging effects, often very subtle effects, to tell its story is Citizen Kane. You know, we have Orson Welles, who was young and, you know, incredibly handsome at the time, you know, kind of boyish when you see him without the makeup on. But as they age him up, it does everything that the movie needs to make those moments work. And it holds up today like crazy. You know, you watch Citizen Kane at, you know, the highest scan resolution, and sure, you can tell that some of it is makeup, but it is incredible makeup. You know, we don't think of movies from these bygone eras as being like really, really strong uses of that kind of makeup, because old age makeup is still, to this day, incredibly difficult, and I think is only getting harder to do well because the filmmaking techniques have changed. You know, you can no longer get away with the sort of softness of certain lenses, or, you know, the softness of film, or the film grain breaking up fine textures and making things like lace front wigs or appliance seams disappear. You know, that doesn't happen anymore. I remember you and I watching Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 2, and we're like, we can see every single like appliance seam, like, you know, wig front is there. You know, it's, you know, the kind of magic that old movies did so well is changing. But both Citizen Kane and Slaughterhouse-Five are excellent examples of how those techniques did so well way back when we don't think that effects makeup was so good. And in reality, it was incredibly good. So anyway, Citizen Kane is my shelf pick, but for makeup reasons. What are you pulling off the shelf?
I'm actually going to pull an episode of television. It's the thing that I always think about when I think about Slaughterhouse-Five, and it was directly inspired by it. This is The Constant from the series Lost, arguably the best episode of that entire series. In which the character of Desmond, who has become unstuck in time, much like Billy Pilgrim, is jumping back and forth through what we're experiencing during the current stretch of time in the season. And it's really his backstory episode. And it's a wonderful piece of filmmaking. There, again, it's another instance where they had to write for all these particular cuts when he would transfer around in time. It's an extremely moving episode. It's got the, you know, I think Lost was, in retrospect, an exceptionally sappy show.
Oh yeah.
But not necessarily always ineffective at its sappiness. And I think that The Constant, which took place in season 4, which I think a majority of people will agree that season 4 is when the show kind of started to lose a lot of its magic.
Yeah, that's when the shtick started to get old.
Well, that's also, I mean, it's when the writer's strike happened.
Yeah.
A lot of things kind of hurt that season and hurt things going forward. But season 4 has The Constant, and it's an absolutely wonderful episode of television. It uses that same idea of, it's my consciousness traveling in time. There's not a machine or anything, and how that could eventually kill Desmond. And how is he going to prevent that? It's wonderful. I can't ever see myself watching that entire series again, but that's an episode I could see myself going back and rewatching. So if you have seen Lost, that's what I recommend. It's just going to watch that episode.
Directed by Jack Bender, director of Child's Play 3.
Yes. He did a lot of their finales. I think he did the series finale too.
Mm-hmm.
Now, we don't have listener shelf picks this week, and the reason for that being, if you go to our Patreon at patreon.com/GenreVision, there is a free to everybody pre-show that explains what we're going to be doing with the listener shelf picks for these next few weeks of episodes. We do still want you to submit listener shelf picks for the episode, but we will be getting to them in a later episode. And if you go over to patreon.com/GenreVision, you can find a whole bunch of bonus material that you can get access to for just $5 a month as a premium subscriber. We do weekly pre-shows, which we're not doing for reasons that you'll hear on that free episode, but we do them every week for our regular episodes, and we do extended currently consumings every month and a whole bunch of other bonus material for all the GenreVision shows. Just go check that out at patreon.com/GenreVision. And we also want to remind everybody that our Q&A episode is coming up, and we need Q's to A. There is a post on GenreVision.com that you can go to leave your question. If you would like to email us, there's a contact little icon at GenreVision.com, and it can link to our email. You can send your questions in that way. We just need Q's to A. We don't have a whole bunch right now, so we need them. So please send those in. And last but not least, if you love what we do here on the show, please go to the Apple Podcast Store and rate and review the show. It is the absolute best currency that we can hope to stock up on right now, considering how small our show has always remained. But the more reviews that we get, the more potential eyeballs and earballs that will get turned on to the show. And if you do leave a written review, we will feature it here on the show. Let's do some currently consuming.
Nom, 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 nom.
Travis, what's been on your plate?
Let's see here. I started watching the new Netflix series Sweet Tooth, which has been getting some critical acclaim. It is based on a DC Vertigo comic by Jeff Lemire, and I understand you've started reading it, and there's a pretty stark contrast between the comic and the show.
Extremely. I read a piece by oh my gosh, Sidon Atlanka, who I believe reviewed it for IGN. And I knew this about the comic before watching the show, but now that I'm starting to read the comic, it's like, yeah, the comic is extremely tonally different than the series. And I can see why in adaptation they decided to take a completely different route for the story. And I've watched the first episode of it on Netflix, and I like it. I'm probably going to stick with it. It's only 8 episodes, thank God. But bless the 8-episode season.
Yes.
All across the board for all shows. But it is extremely different, to the point where I can understand if anybody has a deep familiarity or love of the source material. This can somewhat seem, the Netflix series, like a sanitization or a sanding off of all the edges of the material.
They definitely made it family friendly. Like, I can tell you that, even without any knowledge of the comic, like, this is a pretty family friendly show. I would not hesitate to show this to somebody who was like 9 or 10 years old. The one thing that I really admire that they've done with it, though, well, there's actually a bunch I admire about it, but one of the things I really find that works well is they had Jim Mickle, the director of Stakeland and Cold in July. He came on as the show developer and also directed the first episode and several other key episodes of the season. So
I think he wrote the pilot too.
Yeah, I think he may have, but his style is what basically defines the look of the show, and the show looks incredible. It does not look like standard Netflix fare. First off, it's a Warner Brothers production. It's just distributed through Netflix. So it's definitely got a different look than most of your other sort of like, bog standard Netflix content. It is, it's really impressive so far. I'm definitely going to finish out the season. And there's, there's a certain amount of horror in it, but it's nothing I think that would be unfit for somebody who was 9 or 10. Yeah,
I'm going to stick with it. I think I'm going to take it a little slowly, but we'll see.
All right, what are you pulling off? Pulling off the shelf? No, what are you consuming, dude? What are you eating? What are you drinking? What is it? Tell me what it is.
Well, a movie that you actually spoke about on our last episode of Extended Currently Consuming over at Patreon, I watched Jacob's Wife. This is the new Travis Stevens movie. He's made, I believe, a couple of horror movies. This is starring Barbara Crampton and Larry Fessenden. And my goodness, I'm a big Barbara Crampton fan, have been for a long time, and I'm loving the renaissance that she's been going through over the last couple of years. And my God, is she just dominating the screen in every moment in Jacob's Wife. It is a career best performance, and that's saying something. She's had an extremely storied career, especially in genre. The story is a very kind of simplistic one on the outside, in that it is a town gets invaded by a very Salem's Lot inspired vampire, and Barbara Crampton, who is the submissive wife of the local minister, played by Larry Fessenden, who is also really good in the movie.
Yes.
This is a phenomenal bit of casting for both of them. She eventually gets turned by this vampire and starts doing vampire stuff and finding that she likes it. It's extremely empowering for her. She starts to assert her own feelings and desires a lot more. And the movie did not go down the route I thought it was going to go. I was the final shot of this movie is a very pointed painterly moment, but it's kind of perfect.
I love the ending. Love the ending of this movie. So very darkly funny.
Yeah, it's darkly funny. It's a little ambiguous. It's wonderful. I wanted to cheer when that freeze framed, the directed by. I was like, oh, that's perfect.
It works out perfectly. Really, it ends up being a story about what happens when a power dynamic in a marriage shifts, and it's not even like a toxic marriage. You know what I mean? There's no apparent abuse. There's just somebody who appears to be unhappy, and like what happens if that person suddenly feels that they have the power to change the dynamic in their relationship and ask for what they want. And there's this incredible sequence where Barbara Crampton is alone at home and really sort of embracing her newfound vampiness, and she starts listening to music, and I won't spoil what happens, but it's so fucking funny. I couldn't help but tell you have to. That was the scene I think that I told you have to see this movie.
Oh, I loved that scene. I mean, I was very into it, but she's just got a great performance. There's a great thematic through line, it's very strong. It's also a very fun low budget horror effects movie. Like when necks get bitten into, oh my goodness, does it turn into a 70s samurai film of just gouts and fountains of blood. It's wonderful. It's a smaller effects movie, but I think it tempers that with really good style and fun. I'd hesitate to call it a straight up comedy, because tonally it's not super comedic a lot, but it has plenty of funny moments.
Oh yeah, it's definitely a whole movie that spends I think the whole movie has a wry smile on its face, but it allows for moments of horror,
I mean, yeah, just horror, and it's another example of you could tell this story with no genre element about just a married couple who are kind of have gotten used to being in a very specific rut, and then for whatever reason the wife decides to embrace herself, and the routes that I thought it was going to go, where I think it's not that I wouldn't have been satisfied, but it would have been okay, yeah, that makes the most sense. But where it actually ended up, and the dynamic between Barbara Crampton and Larry Fessenden's character, was what it energized me so much. There are some scenes towards the end there where I'm like, this is so good and so unique of a direction to take this story. And I don't think the way that it's set up, and then as it ends with its ambiguity, it's oh man, it was a really, really good time. Absolutely one of my favorite movies that I've seen this year. And just Barbara Crampton's performance alone. It's another one where it's not asking her to have the big, the Revenant attacked by a bear scene or anything. It's not asking that type of acting. A lot of it is just the way she looks at characters. And there's so many shots in the movie of that where it's just the look, just the close-up of her face. I'm I know everything that she's communicating right now. That's how good of an actress this woman is. Fantastic. Highly recommend Jacob's Wife. And that's going to wrap it up for this week. We'll be back next week, continuing Time Travel Month with Time After Time, the Nicholas Meyer directed film starring Malcolm McDowell, Mary Steenburgen, and David Warner, where it's H.G. Wells versus Jack the Ripper. If y'all haven't seen Time After Time, hunt this one down. This is going to be a fun one next week, and we hope you'll be there. As always, we want to thank you so much for listening. I'm Drew Deitch.
I'm Travis Newton.
And we'll see you next week.
Right here on GenreVision.